Yes, please. The Committee of the Whole is back in order. At the request of some of the colleagues earlier this afternoon, we have a few directors here with us, and I want to thank them for coming down. At the very far end is Director Camacho from Rev and Tax, Director Byrne from Department of Administration, and Deputy Director Lester Carlson from BBMR. And the purpose of having them here is to have any and all of you please ask the questions that you need answered. I know last night we unfortunately were unable to break in time to hear Mr. Camacho. So if there are questions that any of you want to ask of him, and I know there was some issue, some people have direct numbers to Mr. Byrne. I'm going to have to ask for that later on, so I know how to be able to call him at 7 o'clock in the evening for an answer on some things. And so if you have any questions that any of you want to pose, please, the floor is yours. We'll start with Senator Frank Huggan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this evening. Only because we're at the Supplemental Appropriations Revenue Fund component, and when the presentation was provided a few days back, where in fact Mr. Camacho, as the Director of Revenue Tax, questions were asked about the outstanding tax receivables. And you gave us a number of approximately $190 million, and then you started to identify and categorize a number of them, and you came to a figure of $73 million of so-called collectible tax receivables. Now, based on that, and based on what this body has done, has provided you with the authorization and the appropriation to acquire additional personnel within Revenue Tax, and you've been successful in that. You provided numbers at the last discussion in terms of additional collection agents and also additional personnel in other areas within Revenue Tax. Now, to think that $73 million categorized as collectible, that 25% of those revenues, even though they're defined as collectible, would not be collected based on the budget proposal to allocate those additional collections to a special fund called the Supplemental Appropriations Reserve Fund, and to specifically require that those funds be appropriated and used for different Government of Guam services as well as functions. So can we just get an understanding as to your perception, and also the governor has come out vehemently about opposing the SAR fund, when in fact, like I shared with you a little earlier, much of the discussion is recognizing that these funds are, these outstanding tax receivables are collectible. So perhaps if you can start off, Mr. Speaker, if you can start off by sharing with us some of the information that he imparted to the Chair of Revenue Tax, and then we can start discussing about the specifics about whether in fact these $73 million is actually collectible, because they haven't been collected to date, so they would be considered collectible into the next FY. Even if you collect, aside from the tax amnesty, even if you collect 10 million of that 73 million, you would still have a balance of $63 million in that collectible category being carried over to fiscal year 19 for collection purposes. So that's why I'm somewhat, I guess I need to understand, get a better understanding as to why those are viewed as possibly not falling into a supplemental appropriations reserve fund by virtue of some of the discussions we've had before. So, Mr. Speaker, if I can ask Mr. Camacho to please respond.
Mr. Speaker, before he presents that, he does have a PowerPoint that he can probably explain it all and everybody can follow along with it. He does have a PowerPoint presentation that's available for all the colleagues to see, and then they can pretty much, he can explain all the different taxes and how it generates and how it's collected. And I prefer we go that route because that's the handout I gave all the colleagues last night.
All right, fine.
Just tell them next, Mr. Camacho, and they'll roll.
Okay. Next slide, please. I guess, just to begin with, what constitutes the Department of Revenue and Taxation? Basically, these are the different divisions within the department. We got the Administration Division, Tax Enforcement Division, Tax Service Division, and then we also have our Technical Research and Appeals Bureau Division. We got the Real Property Tax Division, and our Motor Vehicle Division, and the Regulatory Division. Each division has its own branches, and I think one of the things that we want to look at within this presentation is really the tax side, which is the enforcement side and the service side. So next slide, please. Every year, we basically collect returns, people file returns, and basically, if you look at the numbers from 2013 to 2017, we've actually processed all these returns every year. And 1040s, 1041s, 1065, 1120, and the total. So every year we actually process all these returns, and then after that we actually segregate what's refund, what's basically taxes that are assessed and goes into the receivable. If you have any questions, maybe you can ask it at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. And you probably notice this very familiar. These are all the taxes that we paid every year by fiscal year from 14 to 2018. We haven't updated the 18 yet. So we normally refund about 54,000 returns every year with roughly about 144 million a year on refunds based on tax year.
Mr. Speaker, if you can just highlight the $144 million in 27 just as an example, because that's inclusive of the child tax credit, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Everything.
So can you give a breakdown of that? Because right now our budget shows $125 million set aside for tax refunds, and it doesn't reflect the amount for the additional child tax credit. So I just want to make sure that as you present this number to our people, that they understand exactly why is it that the legislature is only appropriating 125 when it's 144 that they paid last year. Please. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Again, this is based on fiscal year, but normally the process for income tax refunds, normally we pay the total gross every year. And every quarter, we accumulate all the additional child tax credit, and every quarter we make a claim. So every quarter we get reimbursed. I believe it's roughly about 18 to 20 million a year that we get reimbursed for refunds on additional child tax credit. Senator Torres?
Mr. Camacho, if just looking at the slide prior to that on the number of income tax returns filed, there is a downward number trend from 2015 to 2016. If you look at all 1040s, 1041s, 1065s, 1120s, and yet on the following slide, the amount though of refunds paid, although there's a downward number of
again this.
Tax.
I think I can explain that the one on income tax returns filed is based on tax years. In other words, even though they were filed, let's say for a tax year of 14, it's due 15. Even if the tax year 2014 is due 15, some filed in 16, some filed in 17, some filed in 18. So we gather all those information. So to get a good picture of how many actual returns are filed based on tax year, this is what it really says. On the other side, we refund no matter what basically years are filed in a particular fiscal year. But majority will be the main year will be, for example, if we're refunding refunds in 17, main refunds will be 2016. But aside from that, we do refund other years other than 2016.
So we wouldn't expect that if there was a decrease in the number of files, returns filed, there should be a corresponding decrease in the amounts of tax refunds. And that's because the timing of the tax refunds you're saying is not consistent with the filing, that it can be paid at later times. It's just if you're looking at trends, you would expect that a decrease in one would result in a decrease in the other. A decrease in number results in a decrease in payment and tax refunds, and yet the amount of tax refunds is consistent, notwithstanding the number of returns filed. From year to year, it's consistent, yet the amount of returns filed is lower. I just noticed that, and I just want to point that out.
Well, let me just talk about refunds. Normally, refunds, if you have the same number of taxpayers in 1 year and the following year, normally because EITC goes up, you know, the refund amount for EITC goes up. Sometimes you see that there's an increase in the refunds from the subsequent years because there's more refunds that are paid for EITC. So it varies, in other words.
Okay, I'm satisfied because I'm actually seeing that that is the case, for example, in 2015. All right, thank you very much.
Next slide. Okay, part of the enforcement and revenue and tax really consists of the examination branch, and we put the data together basically on, you know, how much really examination branches are really producing by going out actually and auditing returns. And Senator Fiscal, you asked for how many corporations were audited last. If you look at 2017, we have about 113 on corporations and 1,751 on individuals that were closed in fiscal year 2017. So these are the numbers. I mean, these are additional revenues that we actually go out and produce by auditing taxpayers. If you look at the last 3 years, we're looking at, you know, 49 million deficiencies. Deficiency defined of an increase in tax. So normally these big deficiencies normally don't get paid right away. If it gets contested, it goes to court. So that's part of the receivable that we talk about. I think about $20-some million or 29 million. It's caught up in court, and some of them are paid. But if they're not paid, then again, you know, we go through the process. So this is what constitutes part of the receivables that we're looking at moving forward. Next slide, please. And the criminal investigation branch, which is another enforcement division, basically, if you look at the numbers, you know, ever since back in 2013, you know, we referred so far, if you look at the second to the last, we referred at least 5 cases to the AG's office, and recently we submitted one again for this fiscal year. So we're really looking at a lot of these on the criminal aspect that we're going out there, just to make sure the previous file is mainly, it's really civil cases, and these are the criminal cases.
Mr. Camacho, right now you're showing, I'm sorry, I'm referring back to the previous page, you're showing tax auditors, so they obviously take a look at the information and they audit the numbers and make sure that they are appropriately assessed. You have junior agents and senior agents. I was told about 2 weeks ago that also one of the challenges that Revenue Tax has is the level of support that they presently have for tax assessment processors, the individuals that actually input the information into the computerized system. Mm-hmm. Because obviously if some of the tax returns are provided in written format, in documentation, then you have your tax assessment processors who have to go before the computer and actually input that information, and then it's forwarded to the appropriate personnel for review. Now, how many individuals do you have in that case? Because what was shared with me couple weeks back was that the challenge that revenue tax sometimes experiences is that when the tax assessment is actually, the information is actually inputted into the computer, that it takes that much time, even in excess to a year and a half, 2 years, only because of the need for additional personnel. So can you just address that, please?
Basically, our priority is to make sure that taxes are all assessed. And as you know, for refunds, it's basically first in, first out. But it is our main priority that if a taxpayer files a return and owes taxes, those returns are isolated and quickly assessed, in other words. So they may be talking about refunds, returns on assessment, but if a taxpayer, whether it's BPT or corporations or individual, we basically isolate those returns and we make sure that those are quickly assessed and billed if they're not paid. So, you know, that's our priority. But when it comes to refund, there's a lot of returns. Like I mentioned earlier, there's 54,000 refund returns generally that will be paid every year. So I see, yeah, we can be behind a little bit, but as far as taxes, collection of taxes, those are isolated and are priority for us to actually go after.
Then would it be a helpful tool if in fact you were given the opportunity to hire seasonal personnel? Let's say, for example, and the reason I ask this is because in the taxpayer service component, refunds paid by fiscal year, you're showing that in fact the quantity right now that has been processed is 20.7 versus last year, 2017, was in the neighborhood of 54.2. So what I'm seeing here, unless you can correct me, is that your people are doing an excellent job because obviously interest paid is $417 or $417,000, whatever that amount is.
Which
But
one are
then
you looking at, Senator?
the taxpayer service continued. I'm looking at your 2018 versus your 2017 number, and based on the quantity, so far what has been processed is about 20,000 taxpayers.
That's,
when traditionally it
yeah,
reaches,
these are all, again, these are all returns that are actually being processed. So if we don't process the return, it doesn't get into the picture.
No,
so,
I understand. So you've already processed 20,000, right?
Yes.
Out of a possible 54,000 tax returns.
Yes.
So what I'm asking is, would it be helpful if you were given the flexibility and the authorization to hire seasonal personnel? So after a couple of weeks before April 15, you bring in a full contingent of personnel, and then, but they're only going to be around for like 5 or 6 months to help you process all the tax documents that have been filed.
Yes, that would be good.
That would be helpful.
Yeah, very helpful,
okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Camacho.
So we're at the criminal investigation branch. So we go to the next slide. And so looking at all these returns that we process, and for all those taxpayers that actually, I guess one more slide. Next slide, please. We're now into the accounts receivable that we talked last time. Basically, let me just explain what we have here. On our accounts receivable, we have about $193 million. Of that, we have some receivables that are processed but not actually referred to collection branch for further pursuant of those collections. So we come down to about $186 million that is in collection. But remember last time I told you there's about $57 million that were actually special review and reconciliation that we're looking at right now. And I think I mentioned that about 44 of that is a reconciliation of the withholding taxes that we're looking at. So to put that aside, you know, we come down with really $128 million that we're really actually looking at right now. And just to either further break it down, we basically have those special tax classes of receivable, which basically involves bankruptcy, litigation, offer compromise, and payment plan arrangement. So those are the ones that we put aside, and we have some, about 1.2 that are actually being submitted or referred to collection branch, which comes down to about $73 million of receivable that we're looking at right now. But again, you know, it's not to say that we're not collecting from the special tax classes, because we do collect from those offer and compromise, and also on payment plans or payment arrangement plan. We do collect from that, but those are already set aside. So we got this $73 million, and if I can just go to the next slide, and I'll explain about the $73 million. So what we're actually doing when our collection branch receive all these receivables, the first thing they do is they look at full compliance, look at these taxpayers. They make sure that the assessment is verified and it hasn't been paid recently. And then they start to try to communicate with the taxpayer. So that's the first stage. Then, if they can't communicate with the taxpayer on the first page, then a letter which is called 1058 Final Notice and Demand for Payment, with the intent to levy and the right of hearing. In other words, every taxpayer has a right of hearing. So basically, at that stage, you got 9 million also that's in that stage. Now, the most critical part is basically when we send that letter, final notice, they have about 30 to 45 days, I believe, to act on that letter, or else we're going to start going out and start levying, issuing warrant. Levy is if it's income tax. If it's warrant, we issue warrant to the Superior Court to collect local taxes, and then liens will be filed. So basically, that's the biggest part that we're looking right now, and eventually these can turn into other special classes placed on the special class where the payment plan or for compromise. And if it's not litigated, because if it's litigated, it goes already into the litigation and bankruptcy file. So those are the critical. And also at the end, there's going to be some people that disappear. We need to try and catch them and see. So if we can't find them, we try to locate their employer, try to ways of means of trying to get them. And we did so many efforts. Then we just placed that on the side for like inactive for a while. And placing them in inactive basically is still effective, because for many years, if we put them in an inactive file, and let's say the taxpayer disappear for a few years, goes to the States, come back, and files a return again. So many times they didn't get the refund because automatically the offset would always work. When you owe taxes and you're getting a refund, it automatically offsets. In other words, that's even if you have a payment plan, it offsets. In other words, it's built in already. So these are the things that we're doing on the $73 million. So if there's no questions, I can go to the others.
Can you break this down just a little more? I understand that this 654 are unlocatable, and so that probably are lost. Well, not as easily.
Not necessarily lost, because the statute of limitation for collection is 10 years.
Of this 73, which one of the top three categories would you say you could possibly collect next year? Is there a group here that's more readily available to make the payment? Well, again, of any of these, which one's more? Which one do you think you could possibly have?
Mr. Speaker, may I weigh in on this? Because I don't think it's really a matter of the category. Each year, these
Point
receivables
of order,
are collected.
Mr. Speaker. Is this a DRT question or a DOA question? Because the last time I checked, DRT is the one that collects the taxes.
Yes, we're trying to get the answer, okay? So that everybody has an understanding and we don't have to bring them back?
But I didn't know that DOA is part of the collection of taxes.
Let's just get whatever answer we can get from anybody, and so we can just end the evening.
Each year,
No.
each year, some part of receivables are collected, and whatever is collected out of receivables is recognized as income tax revenue in that year. So when we're looking at the estimates for revenue from tax, it includes collections from these receivables. And I think that's a point that maybe got missed, that I really wanted to make sure everybody understood.
That when they come and they pay Department of Administration, it's for 18, and it might have been for 15 that they're paying the back taxes.
Yes, exactly.
What my question is of these three categories, which one would you most expect that is going to be paid in this upcoming year? Which is probably, do you think, would be more readily available for payment of the set? We know that the last one isn't going to be until they come back to Guam, or you locate them.
Again, you know, receivable is a revolving account. They come in and out. I think when we go to the next slide, you're going to take a look at the numbers when we look at aging, and you're going to realize that those numbers are really spread out based on how old these receivables are. If we want to just go back to the next slide and come back to this slide again, if you look at the aging, go to the aging receivables, you can really look at it by saying between day 1 to 1 year, we have a receivable that are 38 million. From a little bit over a year or more to 2 years, you have that 27. You know, you go down the line. From 2 to 3, you got 36. And then 3 to 4, you got 9 million. I want to just comment on that 4 to 5. The reason why it's large is that's basically the one that I was talking about earlier, that we're reconciling some, you know, special that we're looking at reducing. So if you really look at that, you can see the spread out on those receivables.
I see that, but that goes back to the 194, and I'm trying to stay back on the 73, and even more than just the 73, I'm trying to get from you, how much do you think is reasonably expected to be collected in the next year? I mean, with all the efforts that you're doing in level 1 and level 2.
I mean, obviously, when we look at receivables, we're maintaining $128 million of receivables. Obviously, receivables come in, they get paid, come in, they get paid. We did an analysis basically for this fiscal year, and I think we were averaging at least collecting receivables roughly about $3.1 million or $3.2 million a month. So we do collect receivables, but when you collect receivables, it also depends on how you look at it. Some of them are in the form of cash, some of them in the form of transfers, some of them, a lot of them are in the form of offsets. So basically, you can say that, you know, on a receivable, you can say that taxpayer, you know, is getting a refund of $5,000, but he owes $6,000 offset, but, you know, it's just a transfer from one to the other. So those are the things that we look at. But when we add those up, I believe we were looking at an average of $3 to $2 million of receivables that we collect, you know, on a monthly basis.
And of this 73, how many of them are the same taxpayers that you listed in the amnesty page?
I don't know, and I can't speak of this, where we're working on the 73. I can speak on all the others, but the 73 are receivables that we're working right now. In other words, it's in the process. There's a lot of levies, a lot of warrants that are going out, so those are the active receivables right now that we're
And the amnesty, the number of people that you had in the amnesty program, the 2,400 that you have there, how many of those are some of these taxpayers that are in Category 1 and Category 2?
I remember that we're looking at the numbers. I believe, percentage-wise, I believe 42% of that declared receivables. I mean, of that 33 million declared receivables, I believe 42% is receivables, and 58 represents delinquent non-filers. There's a lot of non-filers that came in.
In the amnesty group?
In the amnesty, yes.
Oh, so they're not even in this?
Yes, they're not even in this.
Yeah, these were people that we didn't even realize had owed taxes, and they just came in and before they were even caught. But you don't have you don't have a. You had a question? No, you can ask it, because I think that that was probably a good question when you were.
Can you just explain what delinquent non-filers are? And I must have missed it. And we are not accounting for them in the amnesty, or are we?
Well, you know, when we offered the amnesty, we offered.
What is delinquent non-filing first?
Delinquent
Non-filer, yeah.
Meaning the amnesty calls for any tax period for 16 and prior years. So it's an amnesty period where taxpayers basically come in and say, okay, you're giving me an amnesty, I'm going to come in and I pay your tax, and you get, if I pay it in full. But before we close that amnesty, every single applicant will have a full compliance check. In other words, they want to make sure that you're in other words, you're covered. In other words, you're declaring all your taxes. So once that full compliance and all those taxes are paid in full, the trade-off basically is that we waive the penalty and interest. Likewise with receivables.
Is that what you did with that $14 million lien that?
When my staff told me, I asked them basically to run a tabulation of what consists receivables and what consists. So they looked at it and they came up with that percentage of 14 on the receivable, and I believe 18 on the non-filers. That's draft report, please. This is the draft report.
Going back to this page with the active status accounts, do you have those you don't have this broken down by individuals? How much of this is individuals, how much are corporations, and how much is withholding, do you?
That one, yes. I wrote it down. On the 194, on the aging, individual is 43.6, corporation is 13.8, BPT is 77.3, and withholding is 60 million. Individual is 43.6, corporation is 13.8, BPT is 77.3, and withholding is 60 million. I just want to say that the BPT and withholding is high because a lot of those BPT are in court. And also withholding is, I mentioned earlier again, we're doing the reconciliation on the withholding. So that's why it's high. So at the end, when we clear that $57 million, those things will go down.
What is your BPT again? I'm sorry. Your BPT figure?
BPT is 77.3.
Okay.
And then what was after BPT?
Withholding tax,
At what?
60.
So, but for the 9,373,000 and the 9,330,000, you don't have those broken down as to how much is individual withholding
I don't have the numbers, but I think we can do that. I don't have the
Okay.
numbers.
Senator Lee had a question.
Sujusmasi, gentlemen, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Camacho, am I understanding you to say that monthly collections for the prior years were about $2 to $3 million a month, or about $24 million on the low end a year?
Well, depending on the year, I mean, like this year we're tracking at least, I think, 3 million, 3 or 3.2 million.
3.2 million a month? Okay.
Yeah, 3, but it's only 9 months. So we don't know what the collection for, it's up to June, so we didn't look into July, August yet. So this is for 9 months.
Understood. Okay, thank you very much.
Duggan.
Mr. Camacho, I don't know if you responded to the speaker's question with regards to the $53 million outstanding. Of that, how much can you anticipate actively collecting over the course of the next fiscal year?
I cannot project, but I can
Because-
project what's being collected right now. I believe, like I said, we're tracking for the 9 months. We're looking at collection of 3 to 3.2 million monthly. So, and again, it really depends because, when I was looking at that category, we can be collecting right now 25, 28 million, but what is really on cash is important because a lot of offsets are happening in between. If you go back to your refund report in the beginning, you can see what's really happening there on the slide. If you can go back to the refund. I think on where it says refunds paid by fiscal year. Look at all the offsets that are happening.
But then, Mr. Camacho, I mean, just looking at offsets and you applied the percentage, $4.3 million offset from a $65.98 million.
Let's say we collect on the receivables 28 million, and depending on what fiscal year. Right now we're looking at 4, but in the previous years you got 8.9, in 16 you got 11.4, and then 15 you got 18.3. So these are receivables that are being offset because taxpayers actually owe. So when they're getting their refund, or whether it's a corporation or individual, they won't get it. It'll offset that receivable.
No, I understand, but even if you look at 2017, that's 54,000 filers, and then 2016, 57,000 filers versus 2018. Right now, on your processing is 20,000. So just looking at the 4.3, and you double that, it would be equivalent to 2017 versus 4.3 out of 65.9 million. So I understand about the offset. I mean, even if you apply a 5 percentage point of the total amount, original refund, then, and you consider that as an offset, or you take the last 3 or 4 years and use that percentage, then I think it's within reason that would be your possible offset for this upcoming collection year, or this collection year. So, I mean, I'm just looking again, if you're looking at collecting above and beyond $3 million to $3.4 million every month, and, credit goes to your people. And now that you have those additional personnel that you have just brought on within the last 3 months, I'm anticipating that the process would also continue to at least sustain that level of collections of prior year accounts receivables, or increase it even more, just slightly. So I'm looking at that. I'm trying to look at the entire equation. And one of the considerations in this budget was a discussion by the Vice Speaker to provide a tax attorney, to give you that option so that you already have your personnel. If you're able to acquire a tax attorney almost on a full-time basis, then that's 2 parts of the requirement for revenue tax, and then it comes back again to automation, because that I consider as a big part, because some of your what did you categorize them as? As those who have not filed but are delinquent filers that never filed, and then eventually
Non-filers, delinquent non-filers, yes.
So $18 million worth.
That's what I was told, yes. And it's a draft. So again, you know, as far as there is a law passed back in, I don't know, during Camacho's time, I believe, where there's a law that allows us to hire our own tax attorney, but from my understanding, and we're trying to get one out soon again, and an RFP or RFI to actually, there's nobody interested. I mean, we even posted in the IRS, we work with our IRS to try to convince these people to come and work for us. But we will try our best. We continue to you know, try to get somebody to come in. I know in those days we had two, but they're basically from the AG's office.
And I appreciate the effort. I mean, if in fact you're aggressively trying to hire an attorney. Can I just go back, Mr. Speaker, just to that aggressive collection action, 53.7 million accounts receivables, Category 3 active status accounts. I find it interesting that we have over 12,502 either individuals or businesses who have not complied with meeting their tax obligation, at least in this active collection, aggressive collection category.
Yes, and those are basically, again, a lot of them are levies, a lot of them are warrants, and basically, you know, at this stage of time, we are communicating with the AG's office, referring a lot of these accounts to because there's a particular section in the local law that allows us to do an injunction, basically asking the AG's office to assist us on filing injunctions with these taxpayers that don't want to come in at all. They're basically, if they're in business, we can stop them and force them to come in and make some kind of or work with us at least for any kind of agreement or any payment plan.
So what's your time response on that? Let's say,
I
for
think
example,
our staff are still communicating. We're just, you know, there's a lot of communication going on. Right now, since the amnesty has gotten into place, we're very busy. If you see all those accounts that are coming in, doing the full compliance for every taxpayer that comes in and apply, we have to make sure that when we sign that amnesty at the end, that there are truly in full compliance, because we don't want to try and basically say that a person comes in and say, I owe you, or I owe you for 2 years, but there's maybe 1 or 2 or 3 extra years that are missing. Yeah. So we're finding that out also at the same time.
Thank you, Mr. Camacho. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Espadon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Camacho, just on that one issue of the aggressive tax collection, they were asking about that 53 million that's still out there. Just a question on that point, though. That's not a 1-year total. That's an accumulation of taxes that have been owed over time. Is that correct?
Yes, and these are probably some of the earlier years, right, that are coming in.
Okay, yeah, no, in fact, if we take a look, I guess, at your aging summary on the following page, a lot of that is probably included in the later years. Is that a fair statement to make? I mean, I know that in the 3 to 4 year aging, the 4 to 5 year aging, there's 50 million, 5 to 6, there's another 9 million, 6 to 7, another 60 million. So bottom line, that 53 million on the aggressive collection of action basically is an accumulation of taxes that are owed over time.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Good enough. And my question really is for you, Mr. Byrne, and that is that when a tax is paid that's owed from previous years, once you receive it, what happens to that? I mean, do you basically try to make payment on past accounts that the government owes and book it that way? And excuse me for my limited knowledge on how this all works, Mr. Burns. So if a tax payment is made from previous years, how is that money used? In other words, say, for example, we collected in 2018, but that tax was from like 2016 or 2015, and if there were some payables from back in 2015, 2016, is the money that's collected today in 2018 used to close some of those accounts that we had back then?
Not really, Senator.
Okay.
I mean, first of all,
how does this work?
we really wouldn't want to have payables from that far back. I mean, people would be chasing us if we did that, just like, revenue taxes chasing the delinquent taxpayer in this case.
Okay.
We recognize that as a tax collection, as part of the tax revenues for the year.
Okay, but if we ran a deficit, say for example, in a previous year, right, does that kind of go, or do we just carry that deficit forever?
Yes, I think I said a couple of weeks ago that, all in each of the years that certainly I've looked at, tax collections have fallen short of the budget assumption.
Right. So just to be clear, and again, excuse me for my limited understanding, right? And so you're just saying that in spite of it all, in spite of what the shortfall may have been in previous years, any collections that are made this year stays this year in 2018 for now.
Yes, we recognize it as this year's revenue.
And then as revenue, where does it go? Or is it if it's not been appropriated, what happens to that money?
Well, effectively, it should have been appropriated because even though it's a collection, it's an addition to this year, there will have been shortfalls under current year's collections. And if you look at the audited statements and that schedule that shows actual against the budget for the general fund, there has been each year a shortfall.
Okay.
So really there isn't an excess of appropriations to appropriate.
Okay, so it's used basically, and just to be clear, it's used to make up any shortfalls that we have from the projections to be able to be applied to this year's appropriations.
Yes, otherwise this year's shortfall would have been bigger. Yes.
Okay, and so as a result, taking a look at this year of 2018 and knowing what we're collecting, we anticipate a shortfall in 2018, fiscal year 2018.
Well, of course, 2018 has been particularly difficult because we had this huge shortfall, this cascading shortfall.
Right. So far, any of the monies that are being collected right now are being used to make up for the possible shortfalls or the obvious shortfalls that we're going to experience in this year.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator Lee, Senator Esteves, then Senator Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just one quick question. Mr. Camacho, based on historical collections, can you give us an idea? Can you break it down into the different categories? So corporate, individual, and withholding? Like how much? I ask this question just because I'm not sure if OFB used your collections data in our revenue estimates. So I'm thinking we could potentially, our numbers could potentially be adjusted upwards based on this 24 million in anticipated collections. So if you could break it down between those three categories.
I don't have that number, Senator, but I can get it to you. The numbers. I'm pretty sure there's numbers for each category,
Right.
but I just don't have that number right now. But if you're saying we collect $24 million, there's certain portion for every taxes that we collect, but I don't have the numbers
Understood.
right now.
Okay, absolutely.
I
I just think it would.
I can get it to you soon. I can.
Okay, I just think it would better inform us and
Okay.
help our revenues to be a lot more accurate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just listening, and it was interesting information that revenue generation from previous tax years is being rolled in and being accounted for as income based on this year. And I think in many ways that lends to more credibility to the SAR. Now, understanding that, I do understand there is the potential for a shortfall based on the budgeting process, But as far as I understand, when we budget revenue projections, it's based on the current tax year. So when we budgeted for so when we budgeted for 2018, we were budgeting based on 2018 revenue streams, which I understand, there's a variation. But I don't believe that it should be able to work both ways, because if there's a shortfall income from previous tax years that's used as revenue I don't think that's accurate, because then if that's the case, if you're able to book it as current revenue, then the legislature should be able to appropriate it as projected revenue. And so the logic's not matching up, because the entire budget process is based off of projections for the upcoming fiscal year, and that really throws it off in terms of determining what is the prior year, which should, for all intensive purposes, get booked into the SAR pending appropriation. And if there's a shortfall that needs to be adjusted, then that's where we can do that in the budget process or make the adjustment. Now, I guess my follow-up question to be DOA or BBMR, what is the shortfall we're seeing total in terms of tracking and projections for closing out 2018?
Thank you, Senator Esteves. I don't have the latest CRER, and it is the 10th. So in about 10 days, we'll have updated that number to be able to provide to the body and the public what it is that we project the shortfall.
How about based off the last CRER?
Yes. But if I can, I'd like to be able to
we'll get to the explanation, just, so we stay consistent with the train of thought. I'll allow you the I'll give you the opportunity, but if we can just look, because what I'm understanding and I want to make sure of is that if the justification is to be using revenue that wasn't projected in the budget process, that was signed into law for obligations that was appropriated based on revenue projections for 2018, that's kind of the train of thought I want to try to understand right now, and I'm trying to figure out kind of an average of what this shortfall should be. Okay.
Yeah. So, if I may, for 2018, due to the efforts of this body in being able to recognize the shortfall in revenue and the commensurate reduction in expenses, we have effectively mitigated that. So we were tracking, I believe at one CRER, 5%, 6% below, which when you're hitting 3%, it triggers a fiscal realignment plan. So we mitigated that because of the fact that we were collectively able to take 10% cuts in the legislature, 10% cuts at the governor's office, and then reduce expenditures allotments for the agencies, including the autonomous agencies. So this body has done a great job in being able to recognize and react to what is transpired. So I think, if you will allow me, the speaker did take that as a segue into the 19 budget, that given what we're doing now and the continuation of austerity measures and the need to kind of bridge a little bit of the gap that still remains, we're not that far off if we continue what we're doing.
I understand that. Now, and that's where now I'm glad you were able to reiterate that based on your, because that's what I had assumed based on what this body had passed. So we had a 5% BPT sunset, and then we had the 30 million that was supposed to be reduced based on the honor system by the government, and in large part that should have made us whole in 2018, correct? So what I'm wondering is why I'm hearing from DOA that there's a shortfall facilitating the need to use unappropriated, non-projected revenue in 2018.
No, Senator, I didn't quite say that. What I said was that historically tax collections have shown a shortfall against budgetary projections in each year. I know this year we kind of made a stop and recalculated it mid-year, but this was the first year that that had happened. And you know, we haven't reached the end of this year to know whether or not there really is going to be a shortfall or not.
And this is why I think, and I caution against the practice of using the money because you have it, while I understand that there's a cash managed responsibility. Because how is the body going to come back and looking into 2019 if we're budgeting too much based on the projection, and you might close out the year because you had money from prior years, using that to cover current year obligations, which when we passed the budget, we thought that it was covered. And so moving forward, you know, that money's not always going to be there, correct? And so how are we supposed to work together and solve these issues if, you know, you jump the gun? I think, and that's what I was saying, the SAR fund should exist to be able to put that money in. And if you needed it to cover the shortfalls because of a failure to budget or the projections were off for one reason or another, I'm sure we could have worked on that bill to adjust the appropriation very quickly. But it's hard to keep track of the numbers when, as the money comes in, it disappears very quickly and nobody knows where it really goes. We don't know where the shortfalls are. We don't know what the true shortfall is, because I feel like we're commingling additional unappropriated, unprojected revenues with the projected revenues of the 2018 budget, and they just don't mix. And that's why I'm saying, if that's the practice we're going to be doing, where previous money from previous years, unprojected, unappropriated, can be used in any fashion that the executive sees fit, then I think that lends to the argument that the SAR fund could also be included in future projections.
Well, as Mr. Camacho said, the average of collections may have varied a little, but generally it's around somewhere between, I think he said, somewhere between 26 and 30 million a year. So if that's consistent from year to year, you're going to see the same effect, i.e. receivables are staying at roughly the same level from year to year. It really doesn't make that difference because that's being factored into the average budgetary figure.
I understand that, but I think and to end with this, Mr. Chairman, I think that's a process. If you're tracking 30 million short, because I'm not saying a lack of collections, could be just a lack of payment from the taxpayers, and there's a variance, even if it's under 3%, I think it would have been better to come to the body for us to make an adjustment to the budget, regardless of whether it hits the threshold of a fiscal realignment plan.
If I could, I've just been notified that I need to stop for a few minutes while the tape, or again, show my age, whatever they do back there has